Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Use of Electronic Informed Consent in a Blood Collection Study, presented by Roche and Medidata. I'm Joe Keenan, contributing editor to Fierce Pharma, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Michael Tucker, Senior Mobile Health Solutions Specialist, Medidata Solutions, and Naima Gibson, Product Marketing Director, Medidata Solutions. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. Just a few technical notes before we begin. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Resources List button at the bottom of your screen. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentation with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button on the left side of your screen, and you can do that throughout the presentation. All right, I think that covers it. We're ready to begin. Michael, please go ahead.
Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for joining today. When Bettiel, Haley, and I started talking about when to do this webinar, we didn't really think about the date, but I think it's appropriate that we're talking about a blood collection study on Halloween. So happy Halloween to all of you. I do want to let you know that Bettiel is not able to join us today. Unfortunately, she's been detained on a flight, so she is en route to her next role. And Naima Gibson, one of my co-workers at Medidata, is joining in to help out a little bit, asking some questions and guiding the conversation to lead us along. So thank you, Naima, for stepping in at the last minute, and we'll wish Bettiel well. All right, Naima.
Yes, thank you, Michael. So thank you, everyone. And we're going to be actually reviewing a case study that's presented, and it's based on work done by Roche Molecular Systems using Medidata's Enroll e-consent system. Roche Molecular Systems is a world-leading R&D and commercial supplier of diagnostic blood screening assays based on their proprietary PCR technologies. Medidata is the world's largest technology company that is solely focused on clinical trials and commercialization. Medidata technology has been used on more than 15,000 clinical trials and by more than 1,000 customers. So Michael, you worked closely with Roche as they planned and implemented the Enroll system for the blood collection study that Bettiel actually has outlined for us. Would you mind taking us through this case study just from a high-level understanding its scope and the significance of the outcomes that were shared at last year's Society of Clinical Research Associates National Meeting?
Certainly. I'm going to do my best impression of Bettiel, but I certainly won't fill her shoes. So I'm going to share Bettiel's slides that she provided for us today and just talk through this with you to understand what really drove the use of e-consent and what they were trying to accomplish through selecting e-consent and how they went about their selection and then what the outcomes were. So the challenge for them was to pilot the use of e-consent on a study, and they looked at a number of different studies that they wanted to try it on, and they thought that they would try sort of a lower risk study with blood collection for a blood plasma and serum samples for patients that were at low risk of HIV infection. And what they were looking at was a way to improve the consent process. They realized that the current process, a paper-based process, meant that patients were being provided with information in large volumes. Sometimes they're very complex, sometimes very difficult for them to understand, and they wanted to see if e-consent would simplify this process for those patients and what other perceived benefits that e-consent would have from a patient and site perspective. So that was really the goal that they set out to accomplish. The method that they followed was to first go out and look at the industry and find out if there was an e-consent product that would meet their requirements. And some of the requirements you hear on the or you see here on the screen, sort of the standard what you would expect: 21 CFR Part 11 compliance for electronic signatures, storage of information, ICH GCP. Guidelines for automated clinical systems, making sure that they understood the types of hardware and the platform. They wanted something that had both a web-based and an app-based component to it, and that all the securities were in place to protect patient information, and making sure that there was role access for sponsors, subjects, study staff, that the data was encrypted both at collection time, in transit, and during storage, and then being able to possibly track the location of where the consent was being given from or taken from, and also the date and timestamp of when that sample was being taken. Excuse me, that consent was being taken. And then they wanted to make sure also that patients weren't able to sign on outdated forms, so that if an amendment came out, if a change came out, and it did on this study, that only the most current forms would be available to the patients. And they also wanted to be able to, in some ways, connect to the ECRF and the EMR for either sharing information in or storage of those forms into other systems. And then finally is looking at being able to promote the reconsenting of subjects when necessary. Like I said before, with an amendment that comes up, being able to make sure that you can identify which patients need to come back in or subjects need to come back in and be reconsented versus those subjects that may have withdrawn or dropped out and, for some reason along the way. They wanted to use the e-consent platform at the study sites that they selected, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And they wanted to then be able to collect some anecdotal feedback through surveys and interviews of site personnel. So in doing their research, they settled on utilizing a product that we provide, and they looked at how it could be deployed in this study. They had a total of 10 sites, so not a huge study, but significant enough in the number of sites, the number of clinical site staff, and the number of participants to get a good statistical view of what perceptions were at the site-based level, as well as perceptions from the patients in some of their surveys. So at the completion of the study, they did a survey, and they sent it out. It had 10 questions. We'll go through those questions so you can see what they were. They designed the questions to try to understand a little bit more about what the site experience was. Bettiel is a CRA, and she's actually out on a monitoring visit right now at a site. And she and her team were very concerned about what is the site perception of the use of this technology. Is it going to hinder their work? Is it going to cause more delays for them in consenting patients? Are they going to have a pleasant experience, et cetera? So the survey, and I've taken this directly out of their tables to share with you, the survey went through the series of 10 questions, so we can go through these real quickly. They wanted to verify whether or not the site personnel felt that e-consent improved the patient's understanding of the study, that it improves the management of overall consent tracking, for example, reconsenting, consent withdrawal, that it increases or does not increase participant compliance, that it reduces paperwork and quality risks, that it lowers the burden on site staff, allowing for them to focus on high-value activities, including specific study participant questions and concerns. Does it reduce administrative burden of on-site monitoring activities by providing an increased amount of information with e-consent to the study participant and also enabling some activities to occur remotely? Does it provide less administration time? Does it reduce the need for complex and time-consuming explanations or study explanation tools? Does it provide information about the study participants' level of understanding during the consent process? And then there was the last one, which is, do you have any other comments, questions, or concerns that they wanted to gain some insight from the site from? So the survey was sent out to 34 different site personnel at the 10 different sites, and the results came back here. We won't go through the results, compare them to each question. But what I wanted to highlight here for you is the difference between disagree or strongly disagree and agree or strongly agree. So those in the gray or pink is the disagree, and those in the blue or yellow is the agree. And you can see for the most part, in fact, in each of the categories, there was a higher level of agreement about the survey questions that were sent out. So Roche, after collecting all of the survey results and after doing their interviews with site personnel, went through and looked at what are the main outcomes from the results of this study. What did we learn from it? And the survey revealed that e-consent improved the overall management of obtaining informed consent, which was important for them to understand. Clinical site staff felt that e-consent improved assessing the participants' understanding of the study, not just improving the patient's comprehension, but improved the ability to assess whether or not that patient had a higher comprehension. So tools that would allow you at the site level to look in and see whether or not a patient has a good understanding of a concept, of a term, of specific areas within the consent process. And then in addition, a little bit more than 3/4 of the site staff stated that e-consent improved the management consent tracking. So the ability for the site to manage things like reconsents and consent withdrawals and expired consents, and those things that sometimes slip through the cracks in a paper-based process and end up being a site finding with an FDA audit or a internal QA audit. They also identified some of the other benefits that they saw from e-consent and the conversations they had. They broke it up into 3 categories: the benefit for sponsors, the benefit for sites, and benefit for participants. And some of these you can see on the screen. I'm not going to read through each one of them for you, but they felt that in the feedback from the sites that things like increased retention and reduced audit and inspection findings were important. Being able to see information about the study participants themselves and the metrics that get tracked with how the patient interacts with the technology. And then from the participants' side, having increased readability or the value of the information that's being produced to the patients, making sure that they have ability to help special populations, for example, with the technology, different ways of learning, different ways of understanding information by using multimedia. So these are just some of the benefits, and we'll share these with you after the call today as well. So their conclusions, and this is the Roche conclusions, were that e-consent can be beneficial to the sponsor, the clinical sites, and the study participants, and that the e-consent solution that they used was centralized, where the sponsor and the clinical site could manage the patient's information or informed consent information remotely. And that included their monitors, so they had 100% remote monitoring on this, and SDV, 100% SDV through the system. So it reduced their monitors' requirements to travel to sites and go through the documented materials at the site. And then additionally, they felt that e-consent may improve patients' understanding of the informed consent components. They couldn't demonstrate that through this particular study, other than some comments that came back from the site staff in understanding how they perceived it with the patients. All right.
Cool. Great. Thanks, Michael. You actually didn't sound like Betsy L at all. But I think that was a good outline. It's a good outline of their study and the effort, that the Roche team put into understanding really the value of e-consent. But now I think maybe we could just switch directions a little bit. And I know specifically that you spent the last 7 years working with a variety of organizations globally and really kind of pioneering the use of e-consent as well as other types of patient engagement technologies. And it'd be great if you could walk us through just some of the learnings that the industry has actually made around e-consent, and perhaps give us a picture of where we are in terms of e-consent and the value.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it is important to understand what we're seeing throughout the industry and hearing back from not just sponsors that are using the system, but from sites and from patients themselves. And we have done a lot of focus groups to get feedback from patients directly on what they perceive as the value of e-consent and how it can be improved even beyond what we did when we initially started out pioneering the industry with e-consent. So yeah, I've got a few slides that'll just talk about some of these learnings, and I think they parallel nicely with what Betiel and the Roche team discovered. I think there are a few things that we can pull out here that help to highlight, and I've grabbed a few of the pieces of information from the industry to understand why paper consent may no longer be enough for clinical trials, why we need to move this direction of e-consent and the value that it brings. What we do know is that about 35% of the patients who decide that they're not going to participate in a clinical trial say that it's because they don't have a good understanding from the paper consent document of what is expected of them on the trial, what the risks are, what the benefits are, what the outcomes are, what the alternatives are. So we've not done a good job as an industry over the past 30, 40 years of simplifying the process. We've just made it a little bit more complicated by adding a lot more jargon and verbiage and legal information into the consent documents. That's not to say that the consent documents are wrong or that they're not good. It's just to say that now that we've got all of this information in there, we've got to find more effective ways to engage the patients and help them to learn about what is a clinical trial, what are they committing themselves to, why is this important, and should they consult with their family members, a doctor, or somebody else before deciding to participate in a clinical trial. So the more we can educate the patient on the front end, the higher quality of patient will be enrolled onto a clinical trial, right? A patient who understands the risks today when they go through the consent process are going to decide whether or not they want to participate, whereas some patients in a paper-based system may not understand those risks until 2 or 3 months into the study, and they decide that they don't want to participate and they drop out, and that's a costly dropout for a clinical trial. I participated in a couple of clinical trials myself years ago, and I cannot remember what the informed consent document said. I can remember a few things about it saying, you know, you could have this happen to you, you could have that happen to you, and I thought, well, that's a calculated risk. But I don't remember the majority of the details about the study itself. So we also know that, from Roche's study that they presented today, that we see sites adopting the idea of using e-consent. A lot of customers that we talk to, a lot of people in the industry that we talk to, say they're a little bit concerned that sites won't get behind the use of e-consent, that they would look at it as replacing them in providing the consent process to the patients. And we now see in most of the studies that we've been doing and getting feedback from sites, getting feedback from the sponsors, that sites are starting to adopt it and understand that they're getting better qualified or more educated questions from patients when they go through the consent process utilizing these types of technologies. They're seeing videos, they're interacting with the document and asking questions, they're being asked questions about what they've learned and reinforcing that information so that when they do have that time to sit down and talk with the site staff before they make the decision to join the study, they're asking better questions right off the bat. We also know that e-consent can reduce and eliminate about 95% of the FDA observations related to the consent process. So we've seen this market mature. It's grown very quickly as opposed to other technologies that, over the years have taken a long time to get introduced into the market. We've seen in a few short years that there is now more of a standardization. We'll talk a little bit about some of the regulatory side of that. We see that there are systems now that deliver a secure environment within the ecosystem to make sure that patient information is protected, that we can deliver this technology in site-based or BYOD. We've done a number of remote studies where patients are consenting remotely and gone through the regulatory side of that and the ethics side of that and going through all the challenges of being able to identify a patient remotely. So the use of this technology has grown considerably in just a few short years. We also see that it's grown not just in the United States and North America, but also globally, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through as well. One of the things that Roche was not able to measure was the patient's comprehension, and does this really give you a better understanding of the information? Fortunately, there was another study that was done in 2013 at the early stages of utilizing eConsent. It was a group in California that utilized our technology. We were independent of the study. We just provided the technology. And what they did is they randomized a group of subjects, and they asked them to go through the consent process. So those who went through on paper were able to ask questions of the doctor that was there. They were able to review the information. And then those who used electronic system had the same ecosystem. They were able to ask questions and review as much information as they wanted to. And then 24 hours to 36 hours later, they were asked to log into a website, and on that website they were presented with a number of questions about the study based on the information that they'd learned the day before. And the results show that those who used the electronic system were able to recall 75% of the information correctly, and those who used the paper-based system recalled 58% of the information correctly. It demonstrated a significant difference in their learning capabilities, their comprehension capabilities, because you're utilizing technology that reinforces the same information. And some customers or some people talk to us and they ask, well, doesn't this mean that they're just spending more time with the materials? And the answer is yes, right? So they're reading through a document, but they're also watching a video and they're being asked some questions. And each step along the way, the information is being reinforced for them. So they're actually spending more time learning about the study, being educated about the study so that they can ask those questions of the site personnel when they're able to sit down and talk with them. So eConsent does allow patients to learn and learn more effectively. I think the Roche paper, and I share it here again, does illustrate that eConsent reduces burden and risk, and I'll talk more about that in the value side when we think about the value of eConsent. But it does allow us to reduce quality risks like missing documents, missing signatures, wrong dates or missing dates, those types of things. And we talk about value, and this is probably the biggest challenge that we've seen in the industry. You know, when you introduce a new technology, everybody says, okay, well, we know what the cost is, but what is the value? What is the return on the other side? What are we saving, or how are we benefiting from this? And this has been, again, one of the biggest challenges for me in the industry in the past 7 years. When we first started pioneering this, we're throwing out a concept or an idea of this, the use of this new technology. It was like the first fax machine that was sold out there. You had to convince somebody that it had value, and that value was going to reduce their workload or reduce effort, or is going to give you traceability, those types of things, and then be able to quantify that and be able to monetize it in some cases for sponsors to understand. And it's, again, been very difficult and challenging to identify what are the value areas. Fortunately, we've got a great team that has put together a long list of process enablements that occur through eConsent, and we've been able to identify what are the processes that get eliminated, what are the processes that get reduced, what are the processes that may get increased or get added to a workload, and then be able to identify the offsets there, the increase and the decrease of the time, the effort that are associated with that. We also are able to look at some of the industry numbers that come back from different types of research to help us understand what is the dropout rate and what are the number of patients that decide they don't want to participate in a clinical trial because they didn't feel like they understood the informed consent document enough. And we can reduce that by X percent. What does that mean for a sponsor in increasing, or a site in increasing the number of patients that can actually go through and be consented and participate. And so, this is just a simple model that was developed for one particular customer who said, look, we've got a study with 300 patients, 60 sites. It's going to run for 24 months. Can you give us some idea of what are the areas that we're going to see value in? And so our value team sat down and went through and looked at areas like paper handling and printing, tracking and reporting, the reports that come out from a site every week back to the CRO or back to the sponsor that says, here's the number of patients that consented, here's the number of patients that came into the clinic and went through the process but didn't consent, here's the number of patients that withdrew from the study, here's the number of patients that failed, etc. All of those things can now be tracked in real time. And they can be reported in real time, so you don't have to wait until the end of the week to get that information back. Being able to ensure that patients are coming back into reconsent, so the ability with the monitoring side to look at information remotely and be able to work with the sites. You don't have to wait 6 weeks to come back on site to see whether the 13 patients that needed to reconsent have actually reconsented. You don't have to wait until the end of a week to get a report back. You can see it real time and work with the sites along the way to make sure that they're staying in compliance with the goals and expectations of the protocol. Things like patient dropouts. Where can we reduce patient dropouts? Where can we reduce the number of patients that are excluded because of compliance issues up front? So all of those add up, and I think now the industry has a good feel through this type of review that we've done, can have a good feel for what should they expect to see in the use of e-consent. It's not just a cost, an additional burden to the project, but we can offset other areas of the research process and reduce costs in many ways. And then it's an establishment of what is the return on investment. Is the study running long enough based on the cost that you're investing in e-consent to recover those costs and possibly save money? And what we've seen, especially on portfolios of studies with customers, is that they see an ROI usually within the first 11 to 14 months on studies, and then they're seeing greater value beyond that. So the longer a study runs, the more patients you have, the higher the value or return on investment that you see on the study. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, this was a great idea. We pushed it. We moved in the industry fairly quickly. The first approved e-consent that was approved for an FDA trial was back in 2010, 2011 with Pfizer. That was a remote consent that we did with them, but that was the first one in the industry that had ever been approved. So the FDA got involved, and we worked closely with them and with our partners in the industry to go through what is the process that we want to employ, and how are we going to ensure patient protections, and how are we going to increase patient comprehension. So a lot of this was just our thoughts of what was going to happen or how it was going to work and how it would benefit, but we didn't have a lot of proof in the industry about how it was going to work. So since that time, fortunately, we've seen a lot of studies that we've run, and we've seen a lot of new companies that have popped up with technologies that have run studies as well. So the industry is able to start seeing the results of all of these studies, thousands now of studies that we can refer back to and look and see the impact that e-consent is having. And so the FDA came out in 2015 with a draft guidance document on the use of e-consent. It was focused on, or it is focused on, sponsors, CROs, and sites to understand how e-consent should be deployed and how it should be used, and not necessarily requirements, but guidelines on what you should include in an e-consent program to make it most effective, make it most beneficial to the patient. Things like it should be able to evaluate whether a patient has an understanding. That was one of their key components there. And so that guidance document had a lot of input from the industry. Some of you on the phone may have directly had input. I know we did. We had significant input in some of the reviews that they'd done with us on studies that they'd conducted, and then questions that they'd asked us. But the ultimate result is that we now have an FDA guidance document that sponsors, sites, CROs can all and IRBs can all refer back to say, what should we include in our e-consent policies when we're looking to run an e-consent program within our organization? And they concluded that the electronic process may use an interactive interface and should be able to facilitate the subject's ability to retain and comprehend the information. Well, we demonstrated that in the 2013 study, but it continues to be demonstrated throughout the industry and the use of the technology. We also saw the growth of interest from other groups like Transcelerate Biopharma, which has been an important leading organization, not just in e-consent, but in a lot of aspects throughout the industry, and in helping to drive policy change, helping to drive standardization, helping to drive an acceptance of the use of technologies that will reduce effort, that will increase safety, that will increase comprehension, all those things. But they came out and developed their own focus on e-consent. They have an e-consent track with industry representatives that share information. They seek information from vendors. They seek information from other people who are not part of Transcelerate to understand what exactly should be the approach to implementing e-consent. And so they have a great number of documents that you can go out to on their website and pull that down. But their result of their evaluation was also that this is a way to improve the ethical approach to delivering consent to a patient. And you'll see a number of articles that are out there. In July of last year, of 2017, I believe it was, there was a number of articles that came out on the use of e-consent and the ethical goals of the informed consent process. Investigators that were supportive of e-consent. More recently, we're seeing changes that have happened. For example, in the UK, the MHRA and the HRA have released a joint statement in supporting both on-site e-consent as well as remote e-consent. It's not a guidance document like the FDA, but it's a statement that comes from them that says we support this. We worked closely with them back in 2014 for the first approvals in the UK and demonstrating the technology, helping them understand the value it could bring, helping them understand how it could be used. And they were already excited about the idea of e-consent, but then they took it upon themselves to start evaluating it internally, and they've done now multiple approvals of the use of the technology in the UK. And we continue to see that around the world in other places as well. India, we work closely with the equivalent of the FDA there to evaluate technologies and how they could be used and address things like the changing laws in 2013, which required the ability for us to ensure that a patient understood that they were on a clinical trial and to have them demonstrate that they understood that capability, and for us to be able to capture things like a thumbprint instead of a signature for those patients who were unable to sign their own name. So a lot of specific regional or global regulations that had to be addressed in the use of the technology. So it does leave us with an understanding of some value that this provides to patients, sites, sponsors, and CROs, and this is very similar to what you saw in Roche's analysis as well. We see that it provides a way for a consistent platform to be delivered and a consistent message to be delivered across the platform to all patients that are involved in the clinical trial. It also allows the sites to have more focused interviews with the patients or conversations with the patients to understand the areas where they're struggling or may have concerns, to address those areas with them, and to identify whether or not that patient is ready yet to participate in the clinical trial. It gives sponsors and CROs timely information that we talked about, improved efficiencies, but I think more importantly, it helps them to know that the 21 CFR 50.20 process of the investigator, their responsibilities of making sure that the patient has a clear understanding of the information, they've had enough time with the information, that all of their questions have been answered. All of those things can be tracked inside of an e-consent platform, allowing the sponsor to feel relieved that there aren't going to be audit findings at the site based on these types of issues or of concerns. And you can see the rest of those on the screen there as far as the automated reporting, patient compliance, regulatory compliance, remote monitoring, and we continue to uncover new benefits and new value in the use of e-consent as the technology grows and as we see things like inclusion or tying into bigger systems, unified systems like EDCs, and being able to trigger events like randomization based on a patient being consented in e-consent and that information being shared directly into these other systems to automate the process and reduce the human factor of or risk of missing information. So I'll pause there. Naima, I think we may have some questions that have come in.
Yes, we have. So I think this is a great time for questions. So thank you, Michael, just for providing that summary of our learning. But yes, this will be a good time to answer some of the questions that have come through on the webinar, and please feel free to continue to ask questions. Thank you.
All right. As Naima said, you can still use this time to ask questions. We have a lot of great questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. So I'll just kind of throw these out to both of you. First question up is, what level of CRA monitoring is required for e-consent?
That's a good question, and we see a lot of value coming back in from the CRA community. Obviously, you know, Betiel is a CRA, and she drove this study because of her quest for for the same answer about that. And really, the level of monitoring goes down from what you do in the paper world because we are doing 100% source data validation in the electronic system, where we can give you a validated system that verifies that certain checkpoints have been met, that timestamps have been applied appropriately, you know, the events have occurred in order. But it doesn't eliminate the need for monitoring, obviously. You're still looking at documents, you're still reviewing timestamps and looking at where we're able to say that events took place. So, for example, we employ a technology on iPads that allows us to track exactly where the consents were signed and where each event was signed. So we keep an audit trail in the system that shows you that a patient was consented at 12:58 today at 3000 Joe DiMaggio Boulevard in Austin, Texas, which is where I'm sitting. And then that 25 minutes later, the same document was countersigned by a registered member of the team, so a PI, a clinician, et cetera, at the same address. And we can help to detect fraud that way if that's a concern, where we can identify the location of where these things happen, the timing of when these things happen. It also allows you to compare signatures within the system to verify, you know, as you see patients coming through, is the same type of signature being used perhaps on patients that are questionable. It allows you to look at across the sites that you're monitoring and be able to look remotely at what is the average time it takes for patients to go through the consent process at Site 101, Site 102, Site 103, Site 104, and Site 105. And maybe at Site 105, they're about 30% less as far as the average time that it's taking to consent at that site. So what is Site 105 doing differently? And it allows you to start asking those questions by utilizing those metrics. So it not only replaces a system for you and replaces processes, but it now gives you better access to information that you wouldn't otherwise have, or you wouldn't otherwise have without digging deeper in conversations with the site. And it also reduces the effort for the site having to track some of that data on their part.
Does e-consent require an equivalent to the subject's signature?
Yeah, so depending on where you are in the world, it does. And the equivalent can be either a written equivalent or it can be an electronic signature depending on the laws and the regulations of the country or the location. In the United States and Canada and most of the world areas that we work in, they accept a digitization or what we would consider a written signature utilizing an iPad or a technology platform that will collect a written signature. So it's in accordance with 21 CFR Part 11 and Annex 11. It is a physical manifestation of the written signature, and we can digitize that, store it uniquely, and make sure that it can't be altered in any fashion or form, so that it can be in compliance with the regulations. But also, it gives you an exact copy of a document that a patient signed on any given day. You can always go back in and print it, and the audit trails prove that nothing has changed on that document. So you'll always have those. So you don't have to Xerox copy and store, a copy, and the patient comes back and says, "I lost my document. Can you print me another copy, or can you, copy another copy of my original document?" You can always provide that electronically or print it directly from the system. In the case of electronic signatures, where you're using a username password, and we do that on our remote studies where patients are logging in and they create a unique username and password. Those, again, comply with 21 CFR Part 11. In some countries, those are not accepted on a document. They still require a paper document. Germany is one of those countries. South Korea is one of those countries. And there are various regulations that govern that and keep them from making those changes until those regulations or laws are changed. Next question.
How is the e-consent connected to EHR and EDC?
Yeah. So depending on the system that you're working with, you may have information that is being used from an EHR to identify patients and invite them to a study. We have, for example, remote studies or virtual trials that do that. So the EHRs can be screened locally, and then the patient's invited to join the study. But once the consent document is completed, you have an electronic document now that is being stored in a system. You can have interfaces to other systems like an EHR or directly into an EDC. For example, in our case, we have a unified platform, so any information that starts in the consent process it can be moved over into the EDC. So we have, I don't want to say it's instantaneous. It takes sometimes 10 to 30 seconds for the information to get passed in the EDC, but we'll pass over de-identified information about the patient. So we actually will create a subject ID based on the consent being countersigned by the investigative staff. Once that milestone is hit, the system can automatically generate an ID, pass that into the EDC, and pass over the information about which documents were signed, what is the status of the patient, what were the date and time signatures for each of the signatures on or date and timestamps for each one of the signatures on each document, and pass that over into your EDC for you to be able to review and look at. We can also set off specific triggers inside of EDCs, so that you can have randomization occur. You can have ECOA accounts set up based on the counter signature. So you can do all these automated processes in these more advanced EDC systems based on a consent being signed and passed over. I think more importantly then is what happens when there's a reconsent. What happens when a patient has to come back in and be reconsented because of an amendment? We can trigger inside of the e-consent platform when a new amendment comes out which patients have to reconsent. It can change their status from being fully consented to needing a signature. And that status can be passed over into these ancillary systems like an EDC, so that you can have triggers inside of there that says you can't treat the patient until they until they reconsent for the study. So those checks and balances are in place to eliminate that risk, that audit risk or compliance risk. And there are a lot of other ways that we've integrated with other systems. We've integrated directly to IVR systems. We're able to pass information into a eTMF, for example. So when a patient signs a document, you could have that passed automatically to an eTMF. So a lot of different ways that we're seeing in the industry that we're changing that process and providing this unified platform across the industry.
Michael, have you seen any populations that are reticent to use e-consent?
That's a good question, and this usually comes up with a question about older patients or older populations, and the answer is No, we don't see that as a big challenge and haven't seen it on our studies. We've got patients that are in their 90s that have used the application. We have a lot of oncology studies that we've run that have patients in their 70s, 80s, 90s that have used the technology. It's dependent upon how the technology is developed. If it's easy for them to use and not challenging for them, we take a little bit different approach. I think we've always been patient-centered or focused on how does a patient perceive the technology. We've done focus groups and gotten feedback from pediatric patients. I've sat in a pediatric hospital with patients and gone through an assent process with them and with their parents to get their reaction to the use of the technology, and a lot of great feedback on how to simplify it from their perspective. We've sat with SMA patients who may have limited mobility of their arms and not be able to fully use technology the way that we would normally use it, and they've given us feedback on the ease of, how can you put buttons in a different place to make it easier or reduce the number of touches that we might have in there. But those are the main types of populations that we usually get questions about. We also get questions about therapeutic areas. Are there any therapeutic areas that e-consent is not really good for or well supported for? We continue to see the cost of e-consent come down in the industry because of sort of the natural progression or development of technology and the ways that we can simplify it and automate a lot of our processes and things like configuration, things like that. So the financial barriers for some of the populations that we've seen in the past seem to be going away. It's still a little bit challenging when you have a rare disease population and you're wanting to run a study for 20 patients in 16 countries and 19 languages. That can get expensive no matter whether you're doing it on paper or electronic, but it can be a little bit more expensive electronically. So those can be some of the considerations that organizations look at when they're deciding what is the appropriate study for us to use the technology on.
Okay, next up is kind of a two-part question. And the question is, how have central or local IRBs responded to e-consent? And is this a concept that they are receptive to, or do they see this as adding complexity to their current process?
Yeah, and that's actually a stakeholder we don't talk about. We say here's the benefits to each of these organizations. The first one is always the most difficult, and the first time we did e-consent, it was approved. The one that was done, that the FDA approved, was done by a central IRB, and we worked very closely with that central IRB to help them understand how we were going to use the technology, and then get feedback from them on what they needed in order to approve the use of the technology. And I think that was really the benchmark in the industry of what we needed to provide. Things like the script and the storyboards for videos, a layout of the system so they could see everything that a patient would see and be able to understand how the patient was going to interact with it. In the first studies that we did, we would send out iPads to the IRBs, and we would have the application on the iPad so that they could sit in their IRB meeting and review it so that they could understand. We've come a long way since then, and most of the central IRBs now, all of the major central IRBs in the U.S. have approved e-consent from multiple vendors, and they have their policies or their practices in place in what they need to approve it, and they don't look at it as an extra burden. What they do realize there are some additional documents they have to review and feedback, and once they feel comfortable with your standard policies or practices, they know what to expect from you as a vendor. So we see, for example, we share into some of these IRB systems, and we get notifications of approvals or questions at the same time that the customer does, and we can respond to those with them directly. So we've seen this growth in the industry of the IRBs and ethics committees. Again, it started out mostly with central IRBs, but of course everybody is needing to use local IRBs. They tend to be a little bit more challenging for us than the central IRBs, simply because they have so many different changes or requirements at a local site. And so, we've had a lot of learnings because of that, where we've had to build enough flexibility capability into our systems that when you configure it, you can configure it differently for the local sites. We have had a few local IRBs that have just said we're not ready for e-consent yet, and they're not ready to move forward with e-consent. And so in those cases, they continue to use paper on the study and use electronic at other sites for the study.
Can patient data be blinded to sites, CRAs, and such when required?
Yes. Yeah, that's an important decision that you make at the beginning of the configuration of how your CRAs will see information. So we have de-identified views and we have identified views. At the site level, you'll see only the information for the patients at your site, and only those people at the site who are that have the need to be able to see that information are able to see it. So an administrative person won't have the ability to look at the patient-related data, perhaps, but the site personnel will. Monitors, it's really up to the sponsor and to the study team as to whether or not their monitors or their CRAs are going to be able to see identified data remotely. When we de-identify it for them remotely, then they still, if they go on site, they still have the ability to look at the identified data with the site while they're there at the site.
The next question up is, how has the GDPR affected e-consent?
Yeah, great question. And you know, all the companies in the industry have to address this. I see the GDPR as being more expansive than just the European Union. I think that eventually we'll see that expand into other world areas, including the United States. Something similar, probably, to the GDPR, not exact, but something similar to it. And it really goes back to giving patients control over their data and making sure that they understand how their data is being used and where it's being used. You know, we've always had to address challenges of where we store data and how it's collected and what you can collect and what you share with the patient to get their permission to collect their data and how to store it. So, you know, as GDPR came out, most of the companies in the industry, I know that we did, spent a lot of time, a lot of money making sure that we were focused on delivering compliance with GDPR. And in the e-consent side, because you are collecting PII and essentially PHI, it's a little bit more highly scrutinized than say EDC data that's all de-identified. So we've just had to make sure that all the provisions are in place and that there's an understanding of how data is stored, where it's stored, and that you know, patients understand that and they have the ability to retract their data from a clinical trial, including their consent documentation and how you answer each one of those things within the legal confines, not just of the GDPR, but of member states that are participating under the GDPR that may have even more stringent laws or regulations there as well.
Michael, what, if any, impact does e-consent have on startup times?
Well, in the beginning, we were challenged, and I think most of the industry was challenged because there was, you know, it took a lot longer to set up e-consent for a study than it does just printing out paper and putting it out there. So having enough lead time to make sure that you're developing or configuring the system along with the rest of the study so that you don't have an impact on the study start time. And in the early days, we had a lot of studies that started up on paper and then switched over to electronic. We've been able to eliminate that primarily on the studies that we work on through configuration tools that we have that allow us to do a much quicker configuration, standardization of systems, and being able to be involved with the study team early enough that we can make sure that the systems are implemented. So from that perspective, it doesn't slow down study times at all. What it does do is allow you to speed up, in many cases, the consent process. And this goes back to the whole idea that you know, 35% of the patients who say they didn't participate in a clinical trial said they didn't do it because it was too difficult to understand the informed consent document. So if we can gain more of those patients early on, that would otherwise have not participated. You're now, say, screening 100 patients, and instead of 35 of them, walking away saying, no, I don't understand it and I don't want to participate, you now only have, say, 28 of them who do that, or 25, or can we get it down to 11 or 10 or whatever it might be. So we can improve startup times by getting patients to join earlier in the study, by educating them. They don't have to go home necessarily and think about it overnight. They may get the information at home before they come into the trial site and then go through the consent process, so we can provide that to them remotely. So we see the shortening of startup times, and we don't see the technology impacting study starts now like it did when we first started out.
All right, next up is, does the FDA and other regulatory agencies recognize and accept e-consent for pivotal drug and device trials? And how is e-consent, and how are e-consent studies audited by the FDA?
Right. Yeah, the FDA does accept the information coming in. There is a question in the European Union right now that I think is on everybody's minds, and we're starting to see some feedback from the EMA on the acceptance of e-consent and how it will be addressed. But we've had a number of studies that where the FDA has come in and inspected. We've had site inspectors that have met with us at regional meetings that have told us that they've looked at our system and that they've looked at other systems as well while they've been doing reviews, and they say that they support, or they say continue to use the technology. They see no reason why not to. So long as it's meeting with the, I guess, the guidance that we're looking at as an industry, so long as it's providing the information that needs to be provided and measuring the patient's knowledge and comprehension, it's superior to a paper-based system as far as an education process. It's superior to a paper-based system in relation to eliminating risk, compliance risk of missing documents, missing signatures, wrong version of a document, those types of things. So the FDA auditors have reported back that they're supportive, at least the ones that we've heard from, and the FDA has reported back in the reports back to our customers that they should continue using these systems. So we've not seen any yet who have said stop using. In the EMA, it's a little bit more, I don't want to say the Wild West, but there are different opinions by different inspectors, and so they're trying to come up with a cohesive response now, and I think we'll see that in the next 6 months or so, where the EMA will come out with a statement about the use of e-consent. And of course, it's up to the member states there to make a decision, and each one of those regulatory agencies, or excuse me, health authorities, to make a decision on whether or not to allow e-consent to be used. And then it's also up to the ethics committees themselves.
All right, how long does it take to configure the e-consent for a study, and what technical background is required to configure?
Well, I can't speak for every company out there. What we have done is provided a what we call a configurator tool. Right now, we utilize it internally. We'll be turning that over to our customers here in the next quarter or so to allow them to use. But it certainly shortened the configuration time from what we used to see. We used to estimate 14 weeks to configure the system. That included doing things like a workshop to understand the requirements, making sure we collected all the documents and getting them prepared, and having developers set up the system, testing the system, getting it approved by the customer through a UAT, and then rolling it out into a live production system and making sure that each site is set up separately. And that was very time consuming, but that's what innovation is all about, right? You come up with a new idea, and you then have to simplify that. And we started this out as a smaller company that got acquired about 18 months ago by Medidata, and the value that we've seen in coming into Medidata is this large engine that is able to simplify these types of processes. They've done it on so many other products already to build these configurators and things that then give those tools back into the hands of an end user. I see that the timelines have come down significantly. I see that we did a demo just recently where we took a customer's study. They had a video, they had their informed consent documents, they had a couple of sites they wanted to set up, and we were able to put it through our configurator in a matter of a day, and then be able to push it out to the site. I don't think that's conceivable for most studies out there. I think you're still looking at a week, several weeks to do this because you're still learning, but utilizing tools like that does simplify it and make it easier. In our phase 1 units, we're seeing it down to now a matter of hours and the standardized use of the technology where they can replicate or do a new study and push the consent document into that new study and have their standardized or generic video. So again, the industry has forced innovation, has forced change, but it also forces companies like ours to become more intelligent in the way that we deliver it and simplify it and making sure that we can give it to into the hands of the people who need to use it. And with proper training, it doesn't take a technological background to understand. It's a drag and drop. It's a build your questions, build your bring a logo over, add a video, press a button, and now you're in a production environment, or now you're in a test environment, so you can try it out. And then when you are ready to push to an iPad, it's simply push to an iPad and set it out there for use at the site.
All right, Michael, thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for the Q&A session. We had a lot of great questions today, and unfortunately couldn't get to them all, but we will be getting back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. Again, I'd like to thank the audience for attending this Fierce Markets webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd also like to thank our speaker for participating and Medidata and Roche for presenting. A reminder to the audience, the webinar has been recorded, and you will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.